About 5 years ago, one time I had broken up with my girlfriend, and I was so shaken by that on my way home from her home, I got lost, and I ended up driving 100 miles away, if you can believe it. I was so lost in thought. And I ended up in a small town just outside of Ellensburg called Vantage. I had driven from Seattle to Vantage, if you can believe it. And I was so exhausted, I pulled into a rest stop. I'll let you Google this. It's called Wild Horses Monument. And to get some sleep. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and the Milky Way was visible, and Jupiter and Saturn were also visible. This was in 2016. They were starting to get closer and closer each passing year around that time. And I decided to Google when they would come into conjunction, and it was December 21st of 2020, obviously. And I thought to myself, that would be a great day to have a honeymoon of some sort, but obviously I got to meet another girl first. We weren't compatible. So at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March of 2020, I got a little bit of a practice with my camera for viewing things like that. Mars and Jupiter had came into conjunction. Mars and Jupiter come into conjunction a whole lot more frequently than Jupiter and Saturn, obviously. I think it's every 3 or 4 years. And I got to practice taking some photographs. Unfortunately, I seem to remember it was very cloudy. I only got a few photographs in between cloud formations, but that was good practice. But what really struck me in awe was that despite what was happening on Earth, right, things were closing down, people were dying, hospitals were jammed, despite all that, and toilet paper was sold out, and you couldn't go to work, people were losing pay, and they were a lot of domestic violence, and you name it. Despite all that, Mars and Jupiter still came into conjunction. I know it sounds odd to say it that way, but it really struck me in awe. And an old friend of mine was just talking about something that gave him great comfort during the pandemic, and it reminded me of things that were always there. Now, the first day of the lockdown, I was living in my car at the time. I used to live in my car during the rest of the year. I would go look for an apartment during the winter, but for 8 or 9 months out of the year, I would live in my car. But then COVID-19 hit, and I had to change my strategy, so I went on to Airbnb. You got to remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were only going to lock down for 2 or 3 weeks. I was only going to stay in an Airbnb for 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning. And I booked the place, and I checked into the Airbnb on March 19th of 2020, and I started writing an AI for the board game of Backgammon. And you got to remember, at the time, the pandemic was only going to be a short-lived event. And so I named the program that I wrote Corona Gammon. Oh, that name has not aged very well, obviously. Sometimes I call the game the COVID-19 Memorial Game now. And writing computer games has created me a lot of comfort during the pandemic. I'm so glad I developed so much in my computer games that I could spend the rest of the pandemic of working on that. Had I not had that to get me through the pandemic, I could have been a bigger mess than I already was. You got to remember, when we kept extending the pandemic, and it seemed like it was going to be forever, I felt like my life was over. And I thought that there was a good chance that I wasn't going to make it through the pandemic unscathed. You got to remember, 10 years ago, I almost took my own life over something much more trivial than a pandemic. And so when I heard about the pandemic, I was scared for myself. What else? So the viewing the night sky. Oh, intermittent fasting, obviously. I'm so glad I made a resolution in 2020 to normalize my relationship with food for 2 reasons. One, it's given me great comfort to have a routine of fasting every other day or every 3 days or whatever it was. It gave me something to focus my mind on instead of all the troubles that are going around. And number 2, I actually got to use this as an opportunity to adjust some habits. It's kind of hard to adjust your habits when you have to see your coworkers or your friends, or you have to drive, so you don't want to get too wired up with fasting, because then it affects your driving. And when you don't have to drive and you don't have people to interact with, it's a lot easier for you to change your eating habits or your sleeping habits for the better. It really is. Unfortunately, a lot of people are using it as an opportunity to change those things for the worse. That's the unfortunate part of it. But if it gives them comfort, I understand that. Anyways, a lot of things that I took for granted before the pandemic really gave me a lot of comfort during the last year.